Homeless veteran is ignored in winter cold until a restaurant manager intervenes. Sam sat on the cold pavement of Nicollet Avenue, one of the busiest streets in Minneapolis, as the relentless winter storm battered the city. His old army jacket, patched and faded from years of wear, barely shielded him from the harsh winds that whipped through the streets. It wasn't just the cold he had to endure, it was the biting loneliness, the isolation that seemed to grow sharper with each passing day. The snow piled up around him, making the world around him look like an endless white void. It was as though the city had forgotten he existed, just one more faceless figure in the crowd of the invisible. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now let's continue. His eyes darted toward the small restaurant across the street, the warm light spilling out from its windows, casting a soft glow against the otherwise bleak landscape. The place wasn't particularly fancy, just a little family-owned diner that had been there for decades. But to Sam, it was the closest thing to a home he had seen in years. He had passed by it countless times, more times than he could count, but tonight the pull was stronger. His stomach grumbled, the hunger in his belly an ever-present reminder of how far he had fallen. Sam had once been a part of a different world, a world where a warm meal wasn't a luxury, a world where he had a family, a home, a purpose. But all that was a lifetime ago, before the war, before the addiction, before the spiral that led him to this point. Now, he was just another homeless man in the city, a veteran whose stories and sacrifices were drowned out by the noise of everyday life. He'd learned long ago not to expect anything from the world, and certainly not from people. They all walked past him, their faces averted, too busy or too afraid to look him in the eye. But tonight, there was something about the way the diner's warm light flickered in the storm that caught his attention. He hadn't always been this way, shy, withdrawn, and alone. Once upon a time, he had been able to walk into a place like that with his head held high. He could hear the chatter of voices, the clink of silverware, the warm hum of conversation, and the scent of hearty food filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the silent, cold emptiness that he knew too well now. Sam ran a hand through his beard, the rough stubble a constant reminder of how long it had been since he'd done anything for himself. "How did I get here?" he whispered to himself, as if the question alone could summon an answer. He didn't expect one, of course. The truth was far too complex for easy answers. The war, the years of transition, the struggles to keep his mind intact after all that had happened. It was all too much. He had been a soldier once, a man who had followed orders, a man who had believed in something bigger than himself. But that was before the bombs fell, before the nightmares started, before the addiction crept in and took everything else. He had tried to fight it, tried to reclaim the pieces of his old life, but they were always just out of reach. The past few years had blurred together into a fog of survival. There were days he couldn't even remember how he'd ended up on this street corner, this particular city block. One day, a year or so ago, he had simply found himself here. He had wandered through the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back, a backpack that was filled with random items he had collected along the way, and a sense of overwhelming confusion about where his life had gone. One wrong turn after another. And somehow, he had ended up outside this diner, just like he always did, perched in the same spot where the snow met the sidewalk, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would drop a coin or two in his cup. But tonight, it felt different. Maybe it was the way the snow fell more heavily than usual, as if nature itself was weighing down on the city. Maybe it was the fact that it had been a long time since he'd seen anyone truly look at him. He wasn't even sure he could remember what it felt like to be seen, truly seen. In the beginning, when he first started living on the streets, he had been approached by the occasional Good Samaritan offering help or a warm drink. But it hadn't taken long for the offers to stop. People didn't stop for the homeless anymore, not in this city, not in this world. It was as if they had all learned to look the other way. If you didn't have a place to live, you didn't exist. That was the unspoken rule. The city's streets had grown colder over time, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The people who walked past him now avoided his gaze, as if they were afraid that seeing him would somehow make them responsible for his misery. Sam knew that feeling well. The feeling that people would be afraid of him if they looked too closely, afraid of the man who had seen too much, done too much, and failed too many times to ever make it back to what normal people called a decent life. As he sat there, wrapped in the heavy blanket that barely kept him warm, he turned his attention back to the restaurant. The window revealed a small group of people seated at the bar, their laughter light and carefree. A couple in the corner booth leaned toward each other, sharing a plate of food and speaking softly, their faces filled with warmth and affection.
Sam's chest tightened.
He had once been one of those people, sitting down for a meal with someone he loved, talking about the mundane details of life, arguing over what movie to watch. He had once had that. And now, all that was left was the cold and the shadows. A wave of bitterness washed over him, but he quickly suppressed it. What good was it to feel sorry for himself? His life was what it was. He had learned that lesson the hard way. No one was coming to save him, not anymore. He had burned too many bridges, made too many mistakes. He wasn't sure if he even remembered what it felt like to be worthy of kindness. He wasn't sure he could even trust kindness anymore. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in a soft, deceptive silence. As the minutes stretched on, Sam's thoughts drifted to the past. He remembered his time in the service, those years when he was part of something larger, when he had a sense of purpose. It wasn't all bad. There had been moments of camaraderie, of belonging, of feeling like he was doing something that mattered. But then, things changed. The war, the violence, the stress of trying to keep himself and his comrades alive, and then the aftermath when it was all over. It had all blurred together. He had come home, but the home he had known was gone. His wife had left him. His friends had drifted away. The family he had hoped would be there to support him was no longer there. That's when it all started. The drinking, the isolation, the feelings of being lost and forgotten. He had tried to fight it, tried to find a way to come back, but the pull of the darkness had been too strong. And now here he was, on this cold street corner, too numb to care about anything except surviving one more night. The money he had collected today wasn't much, maybe enough to buy a cup of coffee if he was lucky.
But there was no real hope in that.
No real relief. Still, he sat there, waiting for the next passerby, the next moment of kindness. It had become a ritual. Waiting, watching, hoping for a coin, a glance, anything that could break the endless monotony of this life. But the truth was, he didn't know how much longer he could go on like this. The cold was getting worse, and every night seemed to stretch longer. As the snow piled higher and the city around him grew quieter, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that, sooner or later, the cold would take everything from him. It was in that moment, as he sat shivering on the pavement, that he noticed something. The door to the restaurant opened, and a gust of warm air spilled out. For a second, he could smell the food, the bread, the rich scent of something hearty. He watched as the people inside, oblivious to his presence, continued on with their lives. A sharp pang of hunger gripped his stomach, but more than that, he felt a deep, gnawing desire, not for food, but for the life they were living, the warmth, the comfort, the sense of being part of something. And that, more than anything, was what made Sam feel truly alone. The snowstorm raged harder now, the winds whipping in gusts that sent the fine flakes into the air like a blizzard of icy daggers. Sam's body had grown numb from the cold, his fingers stiff inside the fraying gloves he had managed to scrounge up from a shelter days ago. The makeshift blanket he clutched around him offered little comfort, its thin fabric more of a mental barrier than an actual shield against the elements. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, an insistent chill that never quite left him. Even his breath seemed to freeze in the air, visible as a vapor before dissipating into the storm. Sam had lived through many winters on the streets of Minneapolis. They were long and grueling, the kind of winters that could break a person's spirit. He had learned to endure the cold with a mix of grim determination and learned resignation. But tonight was different. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him more than usual. It wasn't just the physical cold. It was the emotional cold that had settled deep within him, something even more suffocating than the icy wind. For a moment, Sam closed his eyes, allowing the wind to howl around him. It was a futile attempt to shut out the noise of the world, to block out the constant reminder that he was alone, that he was on the edge of something he could no longer control. His stomach growled, the hunger sharp and insistent, but it wasn't the first time. Hunger had become a constant companion over the years, a companion he had learned to ignore or at least endure. He had learned to quiet the gnawing in his gut, to push it to the back of his mind as he focused on survival. But tonight, it felt different. The hunger was no longer something he could push aside. It was a primal need, a reminder of how much he had lost and how far he had fallen from the man he used to be. There was no way to ignore the ache in his belly, not when he had just seen the warmth and comfort inside that little diner across the street. The smell of freshly baked bread, the simmering pots of stew, the sound of laughter, and the hum of conversations, it all pulled at him in a way he hadn't expected. A strange feeling stirred in his chest, a feeling that he had buried for so long, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Sam had once had a life outside of this. Outside of the streets, the cold, the endless cycle of wandering and begging. He had once known the warmth of a home, the comfort of a hot meal, the joy of sitting at a table and breaking bread with people who cared about him. He had once been part of something. But that was before the war, before the addiction, before the endless spiral downward that had led him to this point. The war had taken more than just his physical health. It had taken his sense of purpose, his belief in the future, his connection to the world. It had stolen the man he once was and replaced him with a shadow, a shell who no longer knew how to live outside of survival mode. He had been a soldier, someone who had believed in something bigger than himself, someone who had served a cause, someone who had had a role in the world. But when the war ended, so did his place in society. The reintegration was harder than anyone had warned him it would be. He tried to fit back into his old life, tried to reconnect with his wife, tried to find his footing in a world that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. But the scars of war ran deeper than he could explain, and the addiction to painkillers, to alcohol, to anything that could dull the constant ache in his chest, had pulled him further away from the people who might have helped him. He had been numb for so long, pushing the pain away until the numbness had become all-consuming. Tonight, as he sat on the cold pavement, he realized something important, something that had been creeping into his awareness over the past few weeks. He wanted something more than just survival. He wanted to feel human again. He wanted to belong to something. He wanted to sit in that warm diner, to taste the food, to engage in the simple act of eating without the constant reminder of his place in the world. He wanted to be seen, to be valued, to be treated like a person again, not a charity case, not a throwaway, not someone who had fallen through the cracks. But there was a deep, gnawing sense of guilt that followed that desire. Sam couldn't help but feel like he didn't deserve it. People like him, men like him, didn't get the luxury of warmth, of comfort. The world had moved on from people like him. No one cared about the homeless veterans. They were forgotten. No one cared about the broken men who had returned from the battlefield with invisible wounds, the men who couldn't fit back into a society that had no place for them. He had tried to pull himself together, tried to make a fresh start, but every time he did, something happened. Another failed attempt to find a job, another relapse, another lost opportunity. The weight of failure had crushed him over and over again, until he was nothing more than a shadow of the man he used to be. And yet, as he watched the people inside the restaurant, he felt a longing rise up in him that he couldn't ignore. They were laughing. They were living. They were normal. It wasn't just the food. It wasn't just the warmth. It was the life that surrounded it, the sense of ease that came with not having to think about where the next meal would come from, where the next shelter would be, where the next day might take him. The people inside the diner had something he hadn't had in years: stability. They had routine, security, peace. Sam felt his heart ache at the thought of it. He closed his eyes, letting the storm rage around him. He couldn't stay out here much longer. The cold was starting to sink deeper into his bones, and the hunger in his stomach felt almost unbearable now. There was no shelter for him tonight, no place to rest. But as he sat there, a thought flickered in his mind, an almost dangerous thought. What if he went inside? What if he just walked through the door and sat down at one of those tables? What if he asked for a meal, just one meal, without the shame of being a beggar? The thought almost paralyzed him with fear. He had never done anything like that before. He had never crossed that line, never stepped into a place where he knew he didn't belong. He had never allowed himself to hope for something better, for fear of the crushing disappointment that always followed. But tonight, the longing felt too strong, too urgent to ignore. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the cup in front of him. It was half full, just a few coins from the few generous souls who had passed by tonight. The night had been quiet, and the cold had kept most people inside, but every now and then, someone would look down at him and toss a coin into his cup. Some did it with a kind of dismissive kindness, their eyes not meeting his as they hurried along. Others, like the young woman earlier, had looked at him with a kind of hesitant empathy, as if they didn't know what to say or how to help. He didn't want their pity. He didn't want their charity. But he also didn't want to be invisible anymore. He didn't want to be the man people avoided, the man whose face they turned away from. The problem was, he didn't know how to break out of this endless cycle. He didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like a failure. A deep sigh escaped him as he looked once again at the warm light spilling out of the restaurant door. He could smell the food, could almost taste it. He could see the joy on the faces of the people inside, hear the clink of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation. For just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to sit at one of those tables, to be part of that life again. What would it feel like to be normal? To eat a meal without guilt? To engage in conversation without feeling like he was a burden? The thought made him feel both desperate and hopeless. He wanted it so badly, but he knew it was an impossible dream. He had long ago accepted that people like him didn't get those second chances. He had made his choices, paid his dues, and now he was nothing more than a fixture of the street. But there was something stirring inside him, something that had been dormant for years. A desire to feel again, to be a person, not just a survivor. The wind howled, snapping him back to the present. The cold was unbearable now. He had to make a choice. Stay out here in the storm, or take a risk. His body was frozen, his stomach empty, his spirit hollow. But as he stared at the diner across the street, he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living like this. He had nothing left to lose. The storm seemed to reach its peak as Sam stared across the street at the restaurant. The snow was falling in thick, swirling sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing, pushing against him as if trying to force him to stay where he was. The cold in his bones had become unbearable, and yet, the warmth of the restaurant on the other side of the street pulled at him with an almost magnetic force. For a long time, he had kept his distance from places like this. There was a barrier between him and the world that was only partially physical. It was psychological as well. It wasn't that Sam was afraid of what might happen if he entered. It was the crushing reality that people like him, men like him, simply didn't belong inside such establishments. People who had been on the streets for so long, who were covered in the grime of survival, who reeked of neglect and loneliness, were invisible to the world. They were meant to remain in the shadows, to be ignored and avoided. If they dared to cross into the warmth of places like that, they would be out of place, unwelcome. Sam stood up slowly, his legs stiff and aching from sitting too long on the pavement. His joints creaked in protest, and the weight of the years seemed to press down on him with every step. His eyes never left the restaurant door. He wanted to go in. He needed to go in. The thought both terrified him and compelled him forward. The thought of walking into that warmth, of sitting down at a table with people who were oblivious to his existence just moments ago, seemed like a dream too distant to reach. But the cold gnawed at him relentlessly, and the hunger inside his stomach became a growing roar that drowned out all other thoughts. He looked down at the few coins in his cup, barely enough to buy a cup of coffee, let alone a meal. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about the act of going in, of daring to take that first step. He had spent years in survival mode, living day by day, scraping by with the bare minimum. There was a comfort in that kind of existence, an almost perverse kind of safety in knowing that the world had already written him off, that no one expected anything from him. It was easier to stay in the cold, easier to avoid situations where he might have to confront the reality of how far he had fallen. The idea of being welcomed inside a warm place like that restaurant felt like an impossible fantasy. Sam took a deep breath, his lungs filled with the biting chill of the winter air, and started to walk across the street. Each step was a battle against the elements, a struggle to push through the mental fog that had held him captive for so long. He felt his body trembling not just from the cold, but from the fear and doubt that swirled in his mind. What if they kick me out? What if they ask me to leave? What if I'm not welcome here, just like every other place? The questions surged through him, but he pushed them aside, one shaky footstep at a time. The closer he got to the door, the heavier his heart seemed to become. It felt as if each step brought him closer to something he couldn't control, something he had avoided for years. Hope. The door of the restaurant was just a few feet away now. He could hear the muffled hum of conversation inside, the clink of silverware, the laughter of people enjoying their meal, enjoying the warmth of human connection. It was everything he had been missing for so long. And yet, it felt like an intrusion, like he didn't belong in that world. He reached the door, his hand hovering in front of the handle. The air from inside the restaurant leaked out, warm and fragrant, mixing with the cold air around him. Sam hesitated. It wasn't like him to hesitate. He was used to making snap decisions, used to moving quickly, to doing whatever he could to avoid attracting attention. But tonight, the weight of the choice bore down on him with a force he couldn't ignore. He could walk away now, turn around and vanish back into the snow, disappear like he always had. Or he could open the door and face the unknown. His hand closed around the handle, and for a moment, he felt a surge of panic. He was about to step into an unfamiliar world. What if they look at me like I'm a threat? What if they see how broken I am? What if they know? The fear gnawed at him, and for a split second, he was tempted to turn and leave. But he didn't. His fingers wrapped tighter around the door, and with a slow, deliberate push, he opened it. The warmth hit him immediately, a rush of heat that felt almost too much after the biting cold of the street. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside, blinking against the contrast. His eyes darted around quickly, taking in the soft, dim lighting, the wooden tables lined up along the walls, and the people seated comfortably at their meals. Everything felt surreal. The noise of conversation, the clink of dishes, the soft laughter of people who had no idea of the turmoil he carried with him. Everything felt like a distant dream, a reality he had long ago stopped believing in. He stood just inside the door for a moment, unsure of where to go or what to do. It felt like everyone's eyes were on him, even though they weren't. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like an imposter in a world that wasn't his own. The warmth around him made him feel almost dizzy, and for a moment, he wished he could disappear back into the snow. He wasn't used to being seen, used to being ignored. Here, in this small restaurant, people were looking at him, but not in the way he was used to. They weren't ignoring him, but neither were they staring at him with judgment. The people around him were just living. They were going about their lives, eating their meals, laughing, chatting. But none of it was for him. Not really. He wasn't part of their world.
Not yet.
Not if he didn't take that next step. He had to move forward. There was no turning back now. The door was behind him, and there was only the soft murmur of conversation ahead. The hostess behind the counter glanced at him for a moment, her eyes pausing just long enough to register his presence. Sam's heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked away, unsure of how to handle the moment. She didn't seem to expect anything from him, but the attention, however brief, felt like an insurmountable obstacle. He wasn't used to people looking at him, at least not without some measure of discomfort or disgust. For a moment, the old instincts kicked in, the ones that told him to look down, avoid eye contact, stay out of the way. But then, something shifted. He felt the hunger in his stomach, the gnawing, insistent ache that told him he had no other choice but to keep going forward. Sam shuffled to a table near the back of the room, pulling out a chair awkwardly and sitting down. He wasn't sure if he had been noticed or not, if anyone had paid attention to his entrance. The hum of conversation continued around him, a comforting background noise that felt almost alien to him. He hadn't sat down in a restaurant in years. It had been so long that he couldn't remember the last time he had been part of something like this. He had been too busy surviving, too busy focusing on the next meal, the next night on the street, the next escape from the cold. But tonight, here he was sitting at a table, inside a warm place, where the world felt both distant and close at the same time. His hands fidgeted in his lap as he waited for someone to approach. His mind raced with 100 different thoughts, all jumbled together in a haze. What was he doing here? What did he think would happen? He couldn't stay long. He couldn't let anyone know who he really was. But as the moments stretched on, something inside him began to calm, just a little. He wasn't being asked to leave. He wasn't being judged. No one was glaring at him, telling him to get out. And that in itself was a kind of small victory. It was a new experience, a strange, unfamiliar situation, but it was a step toward something. Sam didn't know yet what that step would lead to, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope that it might lead to something good. The minutes passed slowly, stretching out in front of Sam like an uncharted road. He sat at the table, his back hunched slightly, his hands fidgeting in his lap as he tried to make sense of the overwhelming warmth that surrounded him. It was strange to be inside, to be somewhere that felt so ordinary, yet so foreign. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasting meats, and the comforting aroma of something hearty simmering in a pot. It was the smell of home, the kind of meal people ate around a table with family or friends. It was a world Sam had once known but had long since been forced to leave behind. A world he didn't know how to return to, a world that felt as distant as the stars. He wasn't sure what he was doing here. Every part of him screamed to leave, to escape the unfamiliarity, to retreat back to the streets where he knew the rules and the rhythms. He understood survival. He knew how to keep his head down, how to disappear into the crowd. He knew how to exist as a ghost, silent, unnoticed, unremarkable. But here, in this small, warm diner, he felt seen. And it was uncomfortable. It was unsettling to be among people who weren't looking at him with pity or disdain, but with a kind of normalcy, as if he belonged here, as if he were human. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had treated him like a normal person. The people who passed by on the street, those who tossed coins in his cup, didn't look at him. They looked through him, pretending he wasn't there. And the shelters, the soup kitchens, the places he'd been to over the years, they were all places where people like him, the homeless, the broken, the forgotten, congregated. People who had nothing left to lose. People who didn't belong anywhere else. But here, this was different. It wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a place of charity. It was a real restaurant, a place for people to relax, to enjoy a meal without worry. And Sam was sitting at a table, just like everyone else. He forced himself to sit up straighter. The chair beneath him felt unfamiliar, like it wasn't meant for someone like him. His shoulders were tense, his muscles stiff, as if his body didn't know how to function in this kind of setting. He kept his eyes trained on the table in front of him, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone around him. He didn't know how to act here. What was the protocol in a place like this? He had never been part of such a simple, everyday interaction in so long. A waitress came to his table, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. She was young, probably in her late 20s, her apron crisp and her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. She gave him a warm, almost casual smile, but Sam could see the hesitation behind her eyes. He wasn't blind to the way people looked at him. Homelessness wasn't something you could hide. His clothes, ragged and worn, his beard that had grown out from weeks without shaving, and the dirt that clung to his skin all marked him as someone who didn't belong. "Hi there," she said, her voice kind but guarded. "Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" Sam cleared his throat, feeling the sudden dryness in his mouth. His voice sounded hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a long time. Just water, please." She nodded, writing it down in a small notebook. "All right, I'll be right back with that." She turned to leave, but then paused. "Can I get you something to eat, too? Our special today is a hearty stew, if you're interested." The question caught Sam off guard. A hearty stew. Just the thought of it made his stomach growl louder, but he hesitated. What did he even say? Could he order? Was it acceptable for someone like him to be here, to take a seat, to eat? It felt wrong somehow, even though there was nothing about the situation that was wrong. This was just a diner. It was just food. But the instinct inside him, an instinct born from years of neglect and rejection, told him that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't welcome. He opened his mouth to decline, to say something vague like, "No thanks," or "just water is fine," but then the words caught in his throat. His stomach was gnawing at him, the hunger almost unbearable now, and he suddenly felt like he might just fall apart if he didn't eat something. I'll take the stew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The waitress smiled again, her face softening with what Sam could only describe as a flicker of empathy.
Great. I'll get that for you.
"It'll be just a few minutes." As she walked away, Sam let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He was still sitting there, staring at the menu in front of him as if it were a puzzle he needed to solve. He hadn't been in a place like this in so long, where the food was just food, where it wasn't about scraping by or just filling the stomach with whatever was available. This wasn't a meal to survive on. It was something to enjoy, and Sam didn't know how to enjoy it. It had been too long since he had allowed himself to experience anything like this. The waitress returned soon after, setting down a glass of water in front of him, the condensation on the outside of the glass cool and refreshing. She placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of him, the smell intoxicating. It was rich and savory, with vegetables, tender meat, and herbs that made his mouth water. The steam rose from the bowl, and for a moment, Sam just sat there, staring at it. He didn't know where to start. He was used to eating quickly, hungrily, shoveling whatever food he could find into his mouth before anyone had a chance to take it away. But this was different. He wasn't surrounded by the harsh, unyielding pressure of survival. He wasn't competing with anyone for this meal. This food was his. He didn't have to hurry. He picked up the spoon slowly, the metal cold against his fingers, and took a tentative scoop. The first taste was a revelation. The stew was warm, comforting, and filled with flavors he hadn't tasted in years. It was rich and hearty, the kind of food that brought people together, the kind of food that signified safety, home, and care. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the taste, allowing the warmth to spread through his chest. It felt wrong to feel this good. Sam couldn't remember the last time he had allowed himself to feel pleasure from food. For so long, it had just been about surviving, about getting by, about the next meal rather than the experience of it. And yet, as the stew settled in his stomach, he felt something shift inside him. He felt, dare he think it, comforted. The gnawing hunger inside him, both physical and emotional, was slowly being satiated. His body began to relax, and his mind, for the first time in a long time, started to quiet. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, but with each spoonful, his mind returned to the same question. Why am I here? What am I doing? As he ate, the familiar self-doubt began to creep back in. He wasn't meant to be here.
He didn't belong.
The people around him seemed so at ease, so comfortable, so normal. He was a stranger in this world, an imposter sitting at a table meant for real people, not someone like him. His hands were still trembling slightly, and he could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. His clothes were old and ragged, his hair too long, his face rough with a week's worth of unshaven stubble. He looked out of place. But no one had told him to leave. No one had told him he didn't belong. The waitress came back to check on him, her expression still kind. "How's the stew? Everything okay?" Sam looked up at her, his throat tight. "It's great. Thank you." She smiled and nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. If you need anything else, just let me know." As she walked away, Sam took another bite of the stew. He had never realized how much he had longed for something like this. Something simple, something nourishing, something that made him feel human again. The warmth of the food filled him not just physically, but emotionally, too. It was a reminder of what he had lost, but it was also a reminder that not everything was gone. That there was still something to be had, still something worth fighting for. As he continued to eat, the restaurant began to feel a little less foreign. The chairs weren't as hard now, the air wasn't as thick with discomfort. He could hear the laughter around him, the chatter, the hum of normal life, and he no longer felt quite as out of place. For the first time in a long time, Sam realized that he wasn't invisible here. People were aware of his presence, but they weren't judging him. They weren't avoiding him. They were just going about their lives. And for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be a part of that world again. For a moment, Sam simply sat there, spoon in hand, savoring the warmth of the stew, the comfort of the familiar routine of eating. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to just be, to exist in the moment without constantly worrying about the next step, the next move in his endless game of survival. The food was good, better than good, and the warmth it provided seeped into his bones, leaving him feeling almost human again. As he looked around the restaurant, Sam began to notice small details that made the place feel more real, more alive. The clink of silverware against plates, the way the waitstaff moved with practiced ease, exchanging brief smiles with customers. The laughter of a couple seated near the window, the gentle murmur of conversation around him. It all created a sense of normalcy, a rhythm that Sam had been shut out of for far too long. He had never felt normal in a place like this. Not since the war. Not since everything fell apart. But tonight, just for this moment, there was a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for far too long. And that realization stirred something inside him, a quiet, tentative hope that maybe he wasn't as invisible as he had thought. That maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in this world after all. He paused his eating for a moment, setting the spoon down on the table and looked around. The restaurant was modest but warm, not a place for fancy dinners or ostentatious displays, but a place where people came to enjoy simple pleasures. Good food, good company. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Sam didn't feel like an outsider. The warmth of the stew settled inside him, both physically and emotionally, and he began to think that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a threshold. A threshold not just of physical warmth, but of something deeper, something intangible, human connection. It wasn't as though he had made friends here. He hadn't shared stories with anyone or laughed along with a group of diners. No, it was subtler than that. It was the fact that he had been seen by others, but not with pity, not with averted eyes. People here weren't treating him like an anomaly. The waitress had spoken to him as though he was just another customer, and even the few people who had glanced his way hadn't looked away in discomfort. It was a small thing, really. But in Sam's world, it was the difference between being invisible and being seen. He picked up his spoon again, but this time, it wasn't with the urgency of someone trying to satisfy hunger. It was with the leisurely enjoyment of someone who had the luxury of time, someone who didn't have to race through every bite. He took another spoonful of stew, the warmth of it spreading through him, and looked up at the waitress as she passed by. She smiled at him again, this time with a hint of acknowledgement, as if she understood that for Sam, just sitting here and eating, feeling like a person again, was a victory in itself. The stew wasn't the only thing that was filling him up. It was the idea that, for once, he wasn't fighting for survival. He wasn't scrambling to get by. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was teetering on the edge of some cliff, ready to fall into the abyss. He was present in a way he hadn't been in years. The quiet comfort of the restaurant, the simple kindness of the staff, the warmth of the meal, it all had the effect of slowly, almost imperceptibly, putting the broken pieces of Sam's life back together. For a while, Sam had been living in a world of shadows. He had been isolated, not just from other people but from himself as well. He had turned his back on the idea of hope, of connection, because it had always felt like a distant dream, a fantasy. But now, in this moment, something felt different. Something shifted within him. He wasn't just eating. He was experiencing life again. And yet, even as he relished the experience, something inside him felt uneasy. Sam couldn't ignore the nagging voice at the back of his mind. It whispered at him, quiet but insistent. You're not supposed to be here. You don't belong in this world. They'll find out who you really are. He pushed it aside, taking another spoonful of stew, trying to silence the voice that refused to be quieted. The warmth inside him, the comfort, the feeling of being treated like a person again, it was all too much to hold at once. He couldn't allow himself to believe that this could last, that it could be real. This was a moment, a fleeting one. It wasn't sustainable. Not for someone like him. As he took a few more bites, Sam realized that the restaurant had filled up around him. There were more people now, talking and laughing, enjoying their meals. The noise, once comforting, now felt overwhelming, suffocating even. The normalcy of it all, the chatter, the clinking glasses, the quiet hum of people enjoying themselves, it reminded Sam of how far removed he had been from this life, from this world. It felt like a reminder that he didn't belong here, that his presence was temporary, that this moment would pass and he would return to his life on the streets. But he had tasted what it was like to be normal again, even if only for a few minutes, and that taste stirred something in him. It made him want more, want to be part of something bigger than himself, want to be seen, to be treated like a person, not an invisible ghost. Just as he was lost in thought, the manager, who had been walking around checking on guests, approached Sam's table. The man was older, with silver hair that matched the gentle smile he wore. He gave Sam a respectful nod, his demeanor calm, warm. "Hi, I just wanted to make sure everything's going well for you," the manager said, his voice friendly but professional. "How's the stew?" Sam looked up, feeling a strange jolt of discomfort, but quickly managed a small smile. "It's great. Really, really good." "I'm glad to hear that," the manager replied, still smiling. "We try to make sure everyone feels at home here. If there's anything you need, just let us know." There it was again, the feeling that Sam had crossed some invisible line. The manager's kindness was genuine, but it wasn't just about the food or the service. It was about the message that Sam was a part of this moment, of this place. He was worthy of being treated like everyone else. And that, in itself, was the kind of recognition Sam had long stopped expecting. "Thank you," Sam said, his voice low but sincere. The words were simple, but they felt like a confession, a moment of vulnerability he hadn't planned on. He didn't know why he felt the need to thank the man. It wasn't like anyone had done something extraordinary for him. After all, they were just doing their job. But somehow, in that moment, it felt like more. It felt like a small acknowledgement of his humanity, his worth. And it made him feel lighter, as if a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying was suddenly lifted, if only for a brief instant. The manager nodded again, his smile widening. "You're welcome. Just let us know if you need anything else." Sam watched him walk away, a sense of unease creeping back into his chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was a brief moment of kindness in a world that was, at its core, indifferent. He was still a homeless man. He was still the man who had lost everything, his family, his home, his sense of self. But for just a few moments, inside this warm, bustling restaurant, he had felt like someone who mattered. And that was something Sam had nearly forgotten existed. He finished the stew slowly, trying to savor every last bite. It was a small victory, really a temporary one. But for the first time in ages, it felt like a real victory. Sam hadn't just gotten food. He had gotten a glimpse of something more, a glimpse of the world he had lost and the possibility of re-entering it. It was a glimpse, and maybe it would fade, but for now it was enough. Sam stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing. This moment was a turning point. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Sam stood outside the restaurant, the cold night air biting at his skin, the distant sounds of traffic muffled by the snow that had begun to fall more heavily. The warmth of the diner seemed to linger in his bones, but it was already starting to fade, swallowed by the icy night. He had walked out of the restaurant slowly, as if afraid that the moment would vanish if he moved too quickly, as if the warmth he had felt, the brief illusion of being normal, would evaporate like smoke. He had taken the longest route back to his spot beneath the bridge, deliberately delaying his return to the cold, lonely reality he had been living in. His footsteps left deep imprints in the freshly fallen snow, but they would be gone by morning, erased, just as he feared his fleeting sense of belonging would be. The meal had been good, more than good, but it was never just about the food. It was the act of sitting at a table and being treated like a human being. It was about not being ignored, not being passed by with averted eyes, but being acknowledged. For a brief moment, Sam had felt like he mattered, like he was part of the world he had lost, part of a world where people ate together, where normal, everyday things took place without shame or fear. But now, as the cold settled back into his bones, as the clatter of the restaurant's cheerful noise receded into the past, the weight of his life pressed down on him once more. He didn't belong there. He knew it. Not really. He was just a man who had fallen through the cracks, whose life had unraveled so thoroughly that even the idea of fitting in seemed like a cruel joke. The warm stew had filled him up, but it didn't fill the deeper hunger inside. It didn't make him whole again. No matter how much kindness the manager had shown him, no matter how welcoming the waitress had been, Sam knew the truth. He was still alone. The same man who had walked into that restaurant with nothing was the same man who was now walking back into the cold streets with nothing. As he walked, he thought about the faces he had seen in the restaurant. The casual conversations, the families, the couples, the friends laughing and eating together, normal people. It was hard to ignore the aching feeling in his chest, the sense of longing that accompanied the fleeting hope he had felt while seated at that table. For a brief moment, he had allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could return to that life. A life of normalcy, of purpose, of connection. But it was an illusion, and illusions always fade. The cold wind bit at his face, and he wrapped his coat tighter around himself, the fabric thin and worn. His shoes, too, were inadequate for the frigid temperatures. Every step felt like a reminder that he didn't have what others took for granted. He wasn't normal. He wasn't like the people in that restaurant. He was broken, a product of circumstances beyond his control, a man whose life had spiraled into something he couldn't fix. By the time he reached the bridge, his hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name. He stood there for a moment, staring down at the muddy ground, listening to the distant hum of traffic. It was so quiet here, so lonely. A small part of him wished he could be like everyone else, someone with a home, with a life that made sense. He wished he could go back to the warmth of that restaurant, to the feeling of belonging that had been so fleeting, so temporary. But he couldn't. That wasn't his life anymore. His stomach churned, but it wasn't from hunger. No, it was something more insidious. It was the hollow feeling that always came after moments like this, moments when he allowed himself to hope, even for just a second. The hope that maybe he could start over. That maybe, by some miracle, he could slip back into the world he had once known. But those moments were always followed by the same crushing realization that this was his life now. This was who he was. A man who had been discarded, left behind, forgotten. He bent down to pick up a few discarded cardboard boxes, using them to create a makeshift bed beneath the bridge. As he arranged the boxes, his mind wandered back to the restaurant, to the faces of the people who had been sitting near him. One couple in particular stood out in his mind. They were young, laughing, sharing their meal, oblivious to the fact that someone like Sam was sitting only a few feet away, wondering what it would be like to be them. The young woman had caught his eye once, and he had quickly looked away. It had been an accidental glance, nothing more, but it had stuck with him. She had smiled, just a brief smile, just the tiniest curve of her lips, but it felt like a sign. It made him wonder if he could be part of that world again. It made him wonder if the life he had lost was within reach. But that was the danger, wasn't it? That tiny flicker of hope that would burn out the moment he acknowledged it. Sam had learned long ago that hope was dangerous. It was like a drug, and the more you fed it, the more it consumed you. And when it inevitably faded, when you were left empty and exposed, the pain of that loss was worse than never hoping at all. He lay back on the makeshift bed, the rough cardboard biting into his skin. He closed his eyes, but the memories of the evening refused to leave him. He could still taste the stew, still feel the warmth of the restaurant, still hear the murmur of voices around him. For a few minutes, he had felt alive. But now, as the night grew colder, those feelings were slipping away. And with them, a familiar emptiness settled into his chest. What had he really gained tonight? A hot meal, a few kind words, a brief glimpse into a world that no longer belonged to him. But none of that changed the reality of who he was, of where he had ended up. It didn't change the fact that he was homeless, that he was alone, that he was living beneath a bridge, while people lived their lives in warmth and comfort. And even though he had felt seen for a moment, he knew the truth. People like him didn't get to stay in places like that. The warmth of the restaurant, the feeling of connection, was fleeting, temporary. And that's what hurt the most. He had tasted something he couldn't have. He had experienced a life that wasn't his, and now, in the harsh light of the cold night, that awareness felt like a wound that could never fully heal. Sam lay there, staring up at the dark sky, his mind racing. He had been so close to believing in something again, so close to thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. But the reality was harsh and unforgiving. Hope had a price, and Sam had learned that the hard way. It was the kind of hope that hurt more than it healed, the kind of hope that made you long for something you could never have. He sighed, a long, deep sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't just the weight of the cold or the hunger that gnawed at him. It was the weight of the world that felt like it was pressing down on his chest, the weight of all the years he had spent trying to forget who he was, trying to outrun the past. He had wanted to believe for a moment that he could still be part of something, anything. But now, in the quiet of the night, he realized that the price of that belief was too high. Maybe it was better not to hope at all. Sam's feet crunched against the snow as he made his way back to the bridge. The cold was even more biting now, the wind sharper, as though the world itself was reminding him that he did not belong in the warmth he had tasted, that he was always going to be an outsider, no matter how briefly he had been allowed to step into the light. It wasn't that the cold bothered him. No, he had long ago learned to withstand the elements. It was the emotional chill that lingered, the creeping sense that he had touched something he could never truly grasp. The bridge, with its low, sagging underbelly, was exactly as he had left it. The ground beneath was littered with the debris of the world, empty bottles, scraps of newspaper, plastic bags fluttering like ghosts in the wind. It was a familiar sight, one that held no surprise, no comfort. And yet, it felt different now. As he neared his makeshift shelter, just a tangle of old blankets and torn cardboard boxes, he felt a profound dissonance, a tug in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. The warmth of the restaurant, the laughter, the voices, the sense of being seen. All of it felt like a memory now, distant and fading, as though he were trying to grasp at something that was slipping away from his fingers. He sat down heavily, pulling the blankets around himself, the familiar weight of his old life settling around him. But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. He was no longer the man who had wandered into the restaurant a few hours ago, unsure of whether he was worthy of even a basic meal. Something inside him had shifted, and it was unsettling. He had tasted hope, and it had been sweet, but it had also been bittersweet, like a forbidden fruit that left a strange aftertaste. He had felt seen for the first time in years, and now that feeling was both a balm and a wound. It was a painful reminder of what he had lost, and of what he could never reclaim. The world inside the restaurant, the lives of the people who filled it, was a world he had no place in anymore. It was an illusion, and he had allowed himself to believe in it, even if just for a moment. The quiet of the bridge, the stillness of a night, seemed to press in on him. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself, to find some solace in the solitude. But the nagging ache in his chest wouldn't go away. It was the ache of longing, the ache of knowing that, for all the kindness he had been shown, nothing had changed. The world he had once known, the life he had once lived, was gone. And though he had touched the edges of something resembling normalcy, that life was as unreachable as the stars. He could never go back. Sam reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the crumpled cigarette pack that had been there for days. He pulled one out, lighting it with a practiced flick of the lighter. He took a long drag, the smoke filling his lungs, burning away the cold. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl up into the night air. The smoke, like his hope, would dissipate soon. It was only temporary relief, but at least it was something. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had walked into that restaurant with a hunger that was not just physical. He had been starving for connection, for acknowledgement. And for a brief moment, he had found it. But now, as the smoke from his cigarette mingled with the chill of the night, he realized that the connection he had longed for was not something that could be handed to him in a meal, in a kind word, or even in a shared moment of humanity. It was something deeper. It was something he had to build for himself, something he had to find within, rather than relying on others to offer it to him. But the hardest part of all was accepting that he wasn't the same man who had come here all those years ago, with the promise of a life full of possibilities. He was a man who had seen too much, who had suffered too much, and who had lost too much. The truth, as harsh as it was that he wasn't whole. He wasn't just broken. He was shattered, in ways he could hardly articulate, in ways he had tried to ignore for so long. Yet, there was a part of him that had started to understand, to accept the reality of his situation. He wasn't going to fix himself overnight. He wasn't going to wake up one day and find that he had magically re-entered the world he had once inhabited. The damage done to him, the scars of war, the years spent in isolation, had left their mark. But that didn't mean he had to give up entirely. He didn't have to give in to the darkness, to the hopelessness that often crept in with the night. The thing that he had learned, through the kindness of the restaurant manager and the warmth of the meal, was that he was still capable of feeling. He was still capable of wanting something more. And that, in itself, was a form of hope, a quieter, gentler kind of hope, one that didn't demand an immediate answer, one that didn't require perfection. Sam shifted in his makeshift bed, the cardboard creaking beneath him. He thought about the people in the restaurant, the ones who had been eating their meals, enjoying their company. He thought about the young woman who had smiled at him, the waitress who had treated him with such casual kindness. They had no idea who he was, what he had been through, or what brought him to this point. To them, he had been just another man in need, a stranger to be fed and forgotten. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that for one brief moment, he had felt seen. For one brief moment, he had felt that he could still be part of the world, not as a broken man, but as a person worthy of kindness. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sam closed his eyes, the dim glow of the streetlights outside the bridge casting long shadows across his blanket. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if he would ever find a way back to that world, the world he had lost. But he had something now, something small, something fragile. It was a sense of self that had been buried beneath years of hardship, a faint flicker of light that he could protect, even in the darkest of times. He could still feel, still hope, still move forward, even if it was only one small step at a time. The night grew colder, but Sam didn't feel it as sharply as before. He exhaled, the breath visible in the night air, and let it out slowly, letting the weight of the day lift off him. He wasn't who he had been, and he wasn't who he would one day be. But in this moment, as he lay in the quiet of the bridge, surrounded by the remnants of his broken past, he was something else, something that could still survive, still fight, still hope, even if that hope was only a whisper. Tomorrow would come, just as it always did. And though Sam didn't know what it would bring, he knew he would face it, just as he had faced the day before. He would carry with him the lessons learned in the warmth of the restaurant, the small flicker of humanity that had been offered to him, and the quiet understanding that he still had the capacity to change, to heal, to grow. It might not be easy, and it might not be quick, but it was possible. And for now, that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.